What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was only the surface? Jesus was trying to prepare us in ways no one ever realized. Not for miracles, not for faith alone, but for a truth humanity was never meant to face. What if every lesson, every insistence on love, every warning was not just guidance, but a signal, a carefully coded message about forces beyond comprehension? Consequences that unfold whether we believe or not. Imagine the teachings you thought you understood, hiding a deeper reality. A reality that now waits for recognition. What if the choices we make with thought and emotion shape existence itself? And the time to awaken is not tomorrow, but now. Stay with me, because what comes next will challenge everything you've assumed about Jesus, about creation, and about your own responsibility in the world. If you love Jesus and you want to see beyond what's been told, tap the heart, share your thoughts, and join the conversation and comment where you're listening from. The story you thought you knew is about to unfold differently, and every second matters. Let's step into the hidden truth together. I grew up inside a story that never changed. Jesus was presented to me as Savior, Teacher, Sacrifice all at once. The message was clean, rehearsed, and complete. He came, He suffered, He died, He saved. Nothing more was required from me except belief. Faith was framed as acceptance, not investigation. You were not meant to question the structure, only to stand inside it and feel safe. I learned early which questions were allowed and which ones quietly ended conversations. Doubt was tolerated only if it ended in reassurance. Curiosity was welcomed only when it circled back to the same conclusions. The story had walls, even if no one named them. Over time, I stopped noticing the walls at all. Belief became something settled like furniture in a room I no longer examined. Jesus existed in the past, frozen in scripture, unmoving, unthreatening. His words were quoted, not entered. His warnings were softened into metaphors, his urgency diluted into ritual. Whatever he was pointing toward was assumed to be resolved. I remember feeling comforted by how finished everything seemed. Salvation had already happened. The future was already handled. Meaning had been outsourced and sealed. All I had to do was agree. But certainty has a texture, and one day, I noticed it. It felt smooth, but brittle like glass, polished until it hides how easily it shatters. The first fracture was subtle, a quiet discomfort when I reread familiar verses and felt something missing between the words. Not error, absence. I realized I had memorized the shape of the story without ever touching its weight. Jesus spoke constantly about attention, about wakefulness, about inner states that mattered more than appearances. Yet, the way I was taught reduced those words into decoration. I began to sense that the message I inherited was not false, but incomplete, like a warning label torn off long ago. Something essential had been removed, not by accident, but necessity. I did not lose faith that day. What cracked was my assumption that faith was meant to be comfortable. The story I thought I knew began to feel unfinished. And once I noticed that feeling, it did not leave. It waited. Quiet. Patient. As if something had been expecting me to notice all along. I did not yet understand what was coming, but the silence around that story suddenly felt intentional and alive, watching quietly. It did not arrive with light or sound. There was no vision, no voice, no feeling of being watched in the ordinary sense. It was simply there, and the certainty of that presence was immediate and undeniable. I did not believe in it. I registered it. The difference mattered. Belief involves choice and interpretation. This did not ask for either. It was closer to noticing gravity after stepping off solid ground. The mind can argue later, but the body already knows. I searched myself for explanations. Fatigue, stress, imagination, unresolved doubt. None of them fit. Hallucinations intrude and demand attention. This presence did neither. It waited without waiting and observed without focus. It did not feel personal, and that was what unsettled me most. There was no message delivered, no emotion projected, no command implied. It showed no interest in whether I accepted it or named it correctly. It felt indifferent to my history, my faith, my skepticism, as if belief itself were irrelevant to the interaction. I realized I was being perceived rather than contacted. Like an object becoming aware it was part of a larger field. The presence did not enter my thoughts, but my thoughts felt exposed within it. Not judged, not evaluated, simply visible. Time behaved differently. Seconds stretched without movement, yet nothing felt delayed. I became aware of my breathing not because it changed, but because everything else grew quiet. The world did not fade. It remained intact, just less important. I did not pray. The impulse never arose. Whatever this was, did not belong to the category prayer reaches toward. It did not resemble the divine I had been taught to imagine. It was not warm or cold, not loving or hostile. It was precise. The most disturbing realization came slowly. This presence had not arrived. It had always been there. The only difference was that I had crossed some internal threshold that made noticing possible. When the awareness receded, it left no afterimage, no confirmation, no proof. Yet, something fundamental had shifted. I could not return to the simplicity I had occupied before. Once you realize you are observed by something that does not need your belief, the world rearranges itself quietly. I understood then that whatever I had encountered was not interested in saving me. It was interested in something else entirely. And that realization would soon change everything forever. After the presence receded, I began rereading the words I thought I already understood. Not for comfort, but for structure. Something in me needed to know why the message had always felt incomplete. I noticed patterns I had ignored before. Jesus rarely explained. He told stories that bent meaning instead of fixing it. Seeds, lamps, servants, weddings, storms. Nothing direct, nothing final. I had always been taught this was kindness, that people needed simple language, that truth had to be made accessible. But the more I looked, the less that explanation satisfied me. Parables did not simplify. They complicated. They forced interpretation. They divided listeners into those who leaned in and those who stayed on the surface. It began to feel deliberate. If Jesus wanted clarity, he could have spoken plainly. If his goal was instruction, he could have listed principles. Instead, he spoke in structures that revealed different meanings depending on the inner state of the listener. The same story could comfort one person and unsettle another. That was not teaching. That was filtering. I started to sense that the parables were not metaphors, but containers. They carried something volatile inside language stable enough to survive time, meaning compressed so it would not detonate prematurely. Truth disguised as story because story could pass through generations without triggering defense. The presence had shown no interest in belief. And suddenly, neither did Jesus. Belief had never been the point. Readiness had. I realized how dangerous direct explanation would have been. To tell humanity explicitly that inner states shape outer reality would have shattered responsibility before maturity existed to hold it. Fear would have multiplied fear. Anger would have justified destruction. Power would have collapsed inward. So he spoke sideways. Love your enemy was not moral advice. It was a stabilizer. Forgiveness was not virtue. It was release of feedback loops. Attention was currency. Awareness was survival. None of that could be stated openly without consequences humanity could not contain. The parables allowed truth to wait. They activated only when someone reached a threshold of perception. Until then, they remained harmless stories. Familiar, reassuring, safe. And that was the most unsettling realization of all. The message had not been hidden from us. It had been hidden inside us, waiting for a moment when consciousness could touch it without breaking. I began to understand that the silence around certain truths was not deception. It was protection. The presence had not contradicted Jesus. It had contextualized him. And for the first time I sensed that the story I inherited was not finished, because it was never meant to be. It was meant to open when we were ready to face what it was really saying. I did not seek the presence again. It returned without invitation, without urgency, without drama. The same quiet certainty filled the space around my awareness, but this time it carried structure, not sensation, not emotion. Structure. I did not hear a name spoken, yet the knowledge arrived fully formed. Slardar. The word did not feel assigned. It felt remembered, as if it had always been there, waiting for recognition rather than introduction. Slardar was not a visitor. It clarified that immediately. Not from a place, not from a future, not from elsewhere. It existed adjacent to perception, layered alongside awareness the way depth exists beside surface. Always present, rarely noticed. I understood then why it had felt indifferent to belief. Belief was irrelevant to proximity. Slardar did not arrive when summoned or leave when dismissed. It became perceptible only when internal noise dropped below a certain threshold. There was no claim of authority, no declaration of superiority. Slardar did not frame itself as guide or judge. It observed. It measured. It waited for alignment rather than obedience. The most unsettling realization followed slowly. Humanity had never been alone, not in the way we imagined, not visited, not monitored in the simplistic sense. Accompanied, witnessed, present with something that did not interfere unless conditions allowed. Slardar existed where thought and awareness intersected, where intention briefly touched probability before collapsing into experience. That boundary had always been there. I had simply never noticed it. I sensed that Slardar was not singular. It represented a category of intelligence defined not by location but by relationship to consciousness. They were not hidden, they were adjacent. The presence did not explain itself further. Explanation was unnecessary. Recognition was enough. The name settled into my awareness like a key sliding into a lock that had always been waiting. When the perception softened, I remained changed, not enlightened, not comforted, or afraid, simply aware that reality was wider than the frame I had been given, and that Jesus had been pointing toward this adjacency all along. Careful not to name what could not yet be faced, the understanding lingered without comfort, pressing quietly against my assumptions, suggesting that the silence surrounding truth was intentional, and that revelation always arrives only when avoidance becomes impossible, and awareness can no longer be postponed. Something had begun to open, and it would not close again easily or gently. The clarification arrived without accusation. Slardar did not correct belief. It reframed purpose. What humanity called salvation was never extraction from consequence. It was preparation to face consequence without collapse. Rescue implies helplessness. Readiness implies responsibility. I sensed how deeply the misunderstanding ran. We imagined intervention as interruption, a hand reaching down to halt failure. But Slardar revealed a different intent. Jesus entered a system already moving toward compression. He did not stop the motion. He taught how to pass through it intact. Collapse was never punishment. It was physics. Inner states accumulate. Unresolved fear compounds. Separation multiplies friction. When density exceeds tolerance, structures fail. Jesus named the conditions. He never promised exemption. The insistence on awareness was not moral pressure. It was instruction for navigation. Watchfulness mattered because unobserved patterns harden. Forgiveness mattered because resentment loops energy back into the field. Love mattered because coherence stabilizes systems under strain. Salvation had been misheard as forgiveness granted from outside. Slardar showed me it was capacity cultivated within, a readiness to hold consequence without denial, to remain present when feedback arrives, to choose response instead of reaction. This reframing explained the urgency without theatrics. Parables trained attention. Practices trained nervous systems. Community trained coherence. None of this was symbolic. It was preparatory. Jesus spoke of signs, not to predict disaster, but to measure readiness. When acceleration increased, when empathy thinned, when attention fragmented, those were not omens. They were indicators. Threshold approaching. I felt the weight of it settle. If collapse was consequence, then no authority could cancel it. If readiness was internal, then no institution could grant it. Each person carried a portion of the field. Collective outcome emerged from cumulative states. Slardar emphasized that prevention was impossible without awareness. You cannot stop a process you refuse to see. Preparation was the only mercy available. The word rescue dissolved. In its place stood responsibility shared and distributed. Salvation meant remembering how to stand when pressure rises, how to keep perception wide when fear narrows options. I understood then why comfort had never been the goal. Comfort delays adaptation. Readiness demands friction. What had been offered was not escape, it was training. And the training had always assumed that consequence would arrive. That understanding settled quietly and irreversible, shaping attention forward into days ahead, where choice would matter sooner than belief could explain itself again or ever again fully. Slardar did not describe love as emotion or virtue. It framed love as alignment, a stabilizing force that reduces internal noise and increases coherence across systems. Love was not how you should feel. It was how reality remained flexible under pressure. Jesus insisted on love because love prevented fragmentation. Fear narrowed perception. Anger accelerated collapse. Separation increased density. Love expanded awareness enough to keep possibility open. This was not philosophy. It was mechanics. I realized morality had been a disguise. Ethics were surface interpretations of deeper physics. Love your neighbor was not kindness. It was synchronization. Love your enemy was not mercy. It was interruption of destructive feedback. Slardar showed how emotional states propagate. One regulated state influences another. Coherence spreads faster than chaos when attention is sustained. But chaos multiplies faster when unconscious. Love was slower but stronger. Fear was faster but brittle. Jesus focused relentlessly on inner state because inner state governed outcome. Ritual without alignment did nothing. Belief without coherence destabilized further. Only lived attention altered the field. Love required presence. Presence slowed reaction time. Slowing reaction allowed choice. Choice preserved flexibility. That sequence mattered more than intention. I understood why love had been reduced to morality. Framing it as rule made it optional. Framing it as structure would have made it unavoidable. Humanity was not ready to hear that reality responds to emotional calibration. Slardar emphasized calibration repeatedly. Not control, not domination. Calibration implied listening, adjusting responsiveness. Love tuned the system like tension on a string. Too tight, snapped. Too loose, collapsed. Love maintained resonance. This reframing stripped comfort away. Love was not reward. It was work. Continuous maintenance of attention and regulation. Exhausting when resisted. Effortless when embodied. Jesus offered practices, not ideals. Breath, silence, forgiveness, awareness, tools disguised as virtues. The realization unsettled me deeply. If love was structural, then hatred was not sin. It was sabotage, mostly unconscious. Reality had never demanded belief. It responded to state. Love was the state that allowed survival through compression. That understanding settled heavily. It meant collapse was not stopped by prayer. It was softened by coherence. And coherence was learnable, which meant responsibility was unavoidable. It removed excuses slowly, quietly, completely, leaving no shelter in ignorance, no refuge in tradition, no delay in consequence. Once awareness arrives, and once it does, nothing returns to sleep again, without cost to everyone involved everywhere. Always watching. The revelation arrived not as a declaration but as recognition. Human states influence outcomes, not metaphorically, not spiritually, directly. Every sustained emotion, every coherent thought carries weight, collapses probability, nudges what will be closer to what is being held within attention. The effect is subtle until aggregated, invisible until it accumulates, dangerous until understood. I realized immediately why this had been hidden. Knowledge of this power too early would fracture systems before the structures existed to manage it. Fear would amplify fear. Desire would accelerate imbalance. Untrained perception would collapse not only understanding but possibility itself. Jesus had known that. He had coded the truth in stories that contained energy rather than words. Parables were containment. Practices were calibration. Silence was protection. Slardar emphasized delay. Awareness was timed. Humanity needed centuries to mature, to learn to focus without fragmenting, to feel without destabilizing, to act without projecting catastrophe. Knowledge itself is a force. Revealed prematurely, it is an agent of collapse. I thought of every story I had memorized, every command interpreted as moral, every miracle reduced to spectacle. They were not simplifications. They were safeguards, containers of potential, passing from one consciousness to the next only when the recipient could absorb without fracturing. The presence made clear the mechanism. Emotional states generate frequency. Frequency interacts with field. Field affects probability. Cumulative states amplify effect. Unseen but real. This is not intuition, not suggestion. Observation and consequence intertwined. Fear, anger, resentment, joy, compassion, attention, gratitude all create ripple patterns. Individually insignificant, but collectively profound. The system responds. It reflects. It multiplies intention that is held, shapes circumstance that is observed. The weight of understanding pressed slowly into my mind. Humanity had been living inside forces it could never measure and never comprehend until now. The price of ignorance had been unconscious creation, consequences accumulating without recognition. The mercy of delay was that most could live without knowing, while some could learn enough to preserve possibility. I felt the first true unease. This knowledge was intoxicating not because it offered control but because it removed illusion. Responsibility had always existed. We had only been blind to it. Jesus had prepared the field, Slardar confirmed. Not to save, not to teach obedience, but to grant humanity the possibility to withstand knowing. The world we inhabit is partially ours to collapse or stabilize. And knowing that truth changes everything. The silence afterward was heavier than explanation. No reassurance, no comfort. Only the quiet pulse of potential waiting for recognition and the weight of what must now be seen. I began to see miracles differently. They were never exceptions to the rules of the world. They were evidence of alignment. Moments when attention, state, and coherence converged enough to tip probability toward the improbable. Physics was not broken. It was observed bending in response to focus, intention, and emotion. That was what made them terrifying. Institutions feared miracles not because they were impossible, but because they revealed autonomy. Control was an illusion. The world could be shaped by those who aligned with it, without ritual, hierarchy, or sanction. Power was not inherited. It was cultivated. The realization unsettled me. Every story I had learned about miracles now seemed less about awe and more about instruction. Feeding thousands, calming storms, raising the dead. Each was a demonstration of effect without explanation. The method was hidden in narrative. The outcome displayed. Humans were given proof without understanding. Proof enough to inspire, but insufficient to destabilize too early. Slardar's presence emphasized the danger. Miracles signal potential. They are the system responding to alignment, not an outside hand intervening. Untrained perception would either reject them or mimic them blindly. Both responses carry risk. Blind imitation amplifies chaos. Rejection prevents learning. Either path is an obstacle to readiness. I thought of history. The fear of miraculous acts was never a fear of impossibility. It was a fear of the unknown structure within humanity itself. If people realized that state and coherence could influence probability, they would begin to experiment without guidance, and the collective field could fracture. Institutions regulated morality not to guide virtue, but to limit early manifestation. The most chilling part was recognition that this had always been a test. Observation without interference. Potential, measured. Readiness, assessed. Miracles were thresholds. Demonstrations not of divinity as an external agent, but of what a human mind could achieve when resonance with the field was attained. I understood why secrecy surrounded them. Knowledge of alignment too early is destabilizing. Proof without calibration produces consequences faster than preparation can stabilize. The fear was rational, the suppression necessary. But the suppression also left humanity unaware of what it had always been capable of. I realized that I had witnessed echoes of these thresholds without comprehension. Small occurrences that went unnoticed, dismissed as coincidence, strange luck, or intuition. I had brushed against alignment without seeing it. The risk is not magic. The risk is recognition. To know that the world bends in response to human coherence is to bear the responsibility of all possibility and all consequence simultaneously. Awareness itself is the miracle most dangerous of all. After the crucifixion, the stories did not end. They were edited, reframed, shaped to fit comprehension levels that could tolerate them without breaking. The subtle mechanics of consciousness and consequence were removed, buried beneath metaphor and doctrine. Authority did not lie. It contained. It delayed. Humanity had not yet developed the coherence to hold such truth. I began to see the paradox. Every parable, every instruction, every emphasis on love was simultaneously a lesson and a filter. The literal story could be shared openly, while the underlying operational principle remained hidden. Those who were not ready would grasp comfort. Those who were ready might perceive the field shifting quietly around them. History was rewritten with precision. The miraculous became moral. The systemic became symbolic. Jesus' message of readiness became a story of salvation. Consequence was removed from the narrative. Responsibility disguised as obedience. Readiness replaced by faith. Faith itself became a containment mechanism, a buffer for collective immaturity. Slardar explained that containment was necessary not because humanity was unworthy, but because exposure to truth without preparation would produce collapse. Knowledge of co-creation, untempered, is destabilizing. Imagine generations discovering that inner states influence probability before they can sustain coherence. Fear, resentment, ignorance, they would amplify effect before wisdom could calibrate it. Collapse would be inevitable. I realized the weight of what had been lost. The early church had preserved the story but removed the map. Humanity retained the memory of love, sacrifice, and moral example but forgot the mechanism. Co-creation became invisible. The threshold of perception remained hidden, quietly waiting for readiness. History was rewritten to protect humanity from itself, not to mislead. Suppression of mechanics preserved potential while allowing growth. A paradox of mercy and delay. Humanity inherited faith while the operational principles were reserved for those who could perceive alignment without fragmenting. Every reformulation, every canonized teaching was calculated. The pattern was deliberate. The containment ensured that awakening would occur only when the collective field could withstand recognition. Until then, the message remained encoded in story and ritual, waiting for perception to mature. I understood then that every alteration, every omission was a preservation strategy. What seemed like distortion was actually a careful scaffolding. Humanity's real inheritance was not simply belief but delayed comprehension. The story had been rewritten not to erase truth but to survive until the world could bear knowing. Jesus had never abandoned his intent. He had encoded it, contained it, and entrusted it to history itself as the field slowly adjusted for eventual reception. Knowledge would awaken when alignment arrived. Until then, history itself held the secret. For centuries, I had assumed forgetting was weakness. Memory lost, knowledge abandoned. Human history seemed to me a series of gaps, errors, moments of misremembered significance. Slardar reframed everything. Forgetting was not failure. Forgetting was design. Consciousness cannot handle full perception of consequence too early. The mind cannot integrate the weight of creation before identity is sufficiently stable. Information arrives in layers. Some layers are only accessible when coherence meets readiness. Too much too soon and collapse is inevitable. Memory itself can be destabilizing. I understood then why so much of history feels incomplete. We remember what we can contain and discard the rest. The discarding is not loss, but protection. Neural pathways adjust to support only what can be held without fracturing sense of self. Forgetting is structural. It is preservation. Slardar emphasized that remembering too soon is as dangerous as never learning. Early comprehension of our influence over reality, without the capacity to hold it intact, would create paradoxes of perception. Fear would amplify effect. Confusion would multiply consequence. Systems, biological, social, collective, would destabilize before adaptation could occur. Forgetting creates a buffer, a waiting period, a form of mercy in disguise. I thought of the biblical texts, the parables, the silences. The gaps were intentional, not accidents of record-keeping. The omissions were thresholds. Only those prepared to sustain perception could cross them without destruction. Memory is dangerous because it contains the power to change interpretation, to alter coherence, to shape outcomes. The most unsettling part was the realization that forgetting was also a test, not of morality but of stability. Every lapse, every erasure, every inability to recall exactly what was observed or experienced was a calibration. Consciousness needed practice in restraint, in moderation, in processing partial truth without fracturing. We were training ourselves unconsciously, one incomplete recollection at a time, to withstand eventual awareness. Slardar explained that Jesus's methods were consistent with this principle. Practices, stories, repeated instruction, ritualized behavior all reinforced memory selectively. Some truths were revealed immediately in story, some only when perception reached threshold. Forgetting allowed the system to integrate without overloading. Awareness without readiness would produce shock. Forgetting delayed shock. I realized then that human evolution was less about gaining information than about learning to hold it. Learning to maintain identity while perception expanded. We were designed to forget until we were ready to remember, designed to encounter consequence in stages and to rediscover truth progressively. This is why direct instruction had always been so dangerous. Words alone could fracture. Practice embedded knowledge safely. Silence protected comprehension until timing aligned. And the knowledge Slardar revealed lingered in my awareness like a current beneath surface water. Forgetting was not error. Forgetting was preparation. Every lapse, a necessary interval for survival. Every memory recalled only when capacity met circumstance. Every human mind was a vessel calibrated over centuries, ready to remember only when remembering would not destroy what it carried inside itself. I felt the weight of the design settle slowly into my consciousness. Forgetting was a mercy disguised as loss. It was not punishment. It was not weakness. It was the first step in preparing humanity to hold the impossible and emerge intact on the other side. For the first time, I began to see history differently. Wars, plagues, famine, systemic collapse. All of it was not punishment, not divine retribution. It was feedback, consequence magnified, reflection of inner fragmentation projected onto the world. Slardar's voice carried across perception without words, a resonance that made the truth undeniable. Human systems mirror internal systems. Every fracture inside, every unresolved fear, every persistent resentment expands into the environment, intensifies probability of breakdown. Jesus' warnings were encoded for perception and for those who could witness without being overwhelmed. The parables were thresholds. The stories of chaos, destruction, and suffering were not predictions, as much as reflections of what would happen when coherence thinned and attention fractured. He never promised immunity. He promised comprehension. Understanding the rules of the system is preparation, not rescue. I realized the magnitude of what had been withheld. Humanity had been left to its own devices to develop resilience incrementally. Every civilization that rose and fell was not random. Collapse followed predictable patterns. Unseen laws, relational and energetic, were violated repeatedly because people did not know the mechanics of consequence. They acted as though outcomes were external, but outcomes had always been internal first. The moment coherence falters, the effect radiates outward. Slardar explained that these feedback loops are cumulative, each generation layering on the unconscious choices of the last. Fragmentation accumulates like sediment in a riverbed. Eventually, when the threshold is reached, the flow of consequence becomes destructive, not merely corrective. Jesus' insistence on love, awareness, forgiveness, attention. These were methods to slow accumulation, to maintain elasticity in the collective consciousness, to prevent the collapse from becoming total. The more I reflected, the more I understood why warnings were always subtle. Explicit instruction would overwhelm. Explicit revelation would fragment identity before systems were ready to hold the truth. Feedback was observable, but only those trained to see patterns could recognize them for what they were. Every moral tale, every ethical guideline, every admonition in Scripture was a mirror, a quiet alert that inner states manifest outwardly, and the world is always listening. I thought about the wars I had studied, the societies that imploded, the cycles of division repeating over millennia. They were not accidents. They were proof of principle. Inner dissonance was never isolated. It propagates, multiplies, accelerates in unseen ways until it manifests. And yet most of humanity continued to operate blind, interpreting feedback as fate, punishment, divine wrath, or randomness. The realization settled in me like ice. We are never unaware of consequence. The warnings were always there. Every story, every lesson, every ritual was a calibration system. Jesus did not protect us from consequence. He was trying to prepare us to see it, to recognize it in ourselves before it overwhelmed us. The danger was never the external world. The danger was the unconscious mind, the unobserved heart, the unregulated self, projecting fracturing patterns into reality. And the most unsettling part was knowing that those patterns are still active, still growing, still waiting for attention. Humanity walks forward untrained, unaware, and yet capable of understanding. If only it remembers to observe the invisible first. Every choice, every fear, Every neglect is part of a signal that repeats across generations, echoing in plain sight, waiting for comprehension. The moment I understood what Slardar meant by convergence, a weight settled across perception that was almost physical. Time itself did not speed up. The world did not change its pace. Yet events, coincidences, consequences, and connections all seemed to compress, arriving with a density that blurred distinction between cause and effect. What had been spread over decades now pressed into months, months into weeks, weeks into days. Patterns previously unnoticed became unavoidable. Slardar explained that convergence is a natural phase in the development of collective consciousness. The unconscious creation of reality is always present, but usually slow enough that humans can dismiss, ignore, or rationalize. Probability stretches and disperses, masking the subtle influence of thought and emotion. During convergence, dispersion narrows. Feedback loops amplify. Unresolved states, latent intentions, accumulated resentment, and neglected fear accelerate into tangible form before the mind can process the consequences. I felt the first hint of it immediately. Minor coincidences became impossible. Miscommunications spiraled into chain reactions that seemed orchestrated by design. Relationships frayed not because of malice, but because the underlying misalignment of attention and emotion could no longer be contained. Work, politics, even random chance events began to intersect in ways that could no longer be explained conventionally. Each of these compressions was a reflection of inner turbulence magnified across the field. Jesus had known this phase would come. Slardar emphasized that the ancient teachings, the insistence on love, the careful calibration of perception, all anticipated this period. Humans had been given centuries to practice restraint, to learn to observe their own internal states without projecting chaos outward, to cultivate coherence before the system demanded alignment. Many had succeeded partially, but full readiness is rare. Compression exposes the unconscious. The illusions we carry, the blind spots we cultivate, the denial of responsibility all converge, colliding into events we interpret as fate, catastrophe, or miracle. It is neither punishment nor reward. It is consequence. Amplified, accelerated, relentless. Those unprepared cannot sustain coherence. Identity fractures under pressure. Systems personal, social, even environmental strain against the distortion of unchecked creation. I began to recognize the signs in daily life. Minor mistakes escalating, accidents multiplying in improbable sequences. Emotional states resonating outwardly and ricocheting back with magnified intensity. Every interaction became a reflection of alignment or misalignment, every thought a potential accelerator. The world felt thinner somehow, more transparent. Boundaries between internal and external dissolved under the pressure of acceleration. Slardar did not offer comfort. There was none, only clarity. Convergence is inevitable. The compression phase does not wait for belief, readiness, or moral virtue. It is a natural consequence of unobserved creation. Humanity has always passed through it cyclically, often unaware. Those who perceive its onset and begin observing their own influence can survive it intact. Those who deny it collapse quietly, swept into the patterns they themselves have set into motion. I realized that everything I had been taught, everything humanity had preserved and forgotten, was preparation for this very phase. And the terrifying truth was that convergence is not coming. It is already here. Every moment, every choice, every unexamined impulse contributes to its acceleration, compressing reality around the human mind like a tide no one can stop and no one can escape. Faith had always seemed to me a shield, a stabilizing force that carried people through uncertainty and fear. It was the thread that allowed civilizations to endure collapse, suffering, and the unknowable. Faith, simplified, condensed, and contained reality. It was comforting because it required little observation and demanded little responsibility. For centuries, it had protected humanity from its own inexperience. Slardar explained that the protective function of faith is now exhausted. It no longer shields, it delays. It allows humans to persist in illusion, postponing recognition of their role as co-creators. When the acceleration of consequence surpasses the capacity for interpretation, faith becomes a trap. Belief without awareness amplifies unconscious creation rather than restraining it. What was once safety now invites peril. The warning was subtle but undeniable. Faith cannot substitute for comprehension. It cannot substitute for perception. Faith is passive. Awareness is active. To rely solely on belief in the unseen, in the divine, in tradition, while ignoring the feedback of consciousness itself is to ignore the rules of creation. In the past, faith could absorb the shock of consequence because events unfolded slowly. Now, the world compresses. Consequence arrives faster than belief can process. And the unobserved mind projects outcomes blindly, often destructively. I thought about the parables, the stories repeated in Sunday schools and family gatherings. They were protective, yes, but they were also instructions, indirect, layered, designed to train perception while shielding the mind from collapse. Jesus had known that once humanity reached this point of convergence, faith alone would become insufficient. Belief without observation would no longer stabilize reality. It would delay accountability, concentrate consequence, and magnify collapse. I began to recognize the subtle patterns in my own life, in the lives of those around me. Acts of devotion often coincided with unexpected chaos. Good intentions had outcomes that defied morality and ethics because the mind and heart were not aligned with observation, coherence, and integration. Faith alone had provided comfort, but not calibration. The system had been carrying us gently until the point where carrying us gently was no longer possible. Slardar emphasized that the transition from faith to awareness is not a loss of belief, but a deepening of perception. Awareness does not contradict faith, it integrates it. Faith is the seed, awareness is the cultivation. Without cultivation, belief rots, decays, or transforms into denial. Humanity had reached the threshold where denial is dangerous, where the unconscious mind shapes reality faster than the conscious mind can correct it. The implication was staggering. Every generation had been prepared incrementally to perceive its influence on reality, to recognize consequence, to calibrate coherence. Those who rely solely on faith now risk accelerating collapse. Faith without observation creates patterns that are magnified in compression. Faith untempered by awareness becomes the agent of unintended outcomes. I felt a weight settle across perception as Slardar's meaning crystallized. Belief alone no longer protects. Belief alone no longer explains. Belief without awareness is now a liability. Humanity must awaken to itself, perceive its own influence, and take responsibility. Otherwise, the consequences that Jesus once warned about, subtly, through story and action, will arrive with a force faith cannot absorb. We are entering the era when belief is not enough. Awareness must follow, or collapse becomes inevitable. Fear is a shape, a force, a pressure that humans rarely recognize in real time. It is not abstract. It compresses thought, warps perception, and alters outcome. Slardar revealed that Jesus understood this with a clarity that humanity could not yet bear. Fear, when left unchecked, does not simply produce anxiety or hesitation. It imprints itself onto the framework of reality. The collective unconscious absorbs it, magnifies it, and crystallizes it into consequence. That is why silence was necessary. Silence was not negligence. Silence was mercy. I began to see the world differently. The wars, the oppression, The systemic failures that had always seemed so random or moralistic now appeared as evidence of cumulative fear. Not divine punishment. Not human failure. Not luck. Fear projected outward, shaping probability, hardening potential into forms that resist correction. Every act of terror, every outbreak of mass hysteria, every wave of panic or desperation was a proof of principle. Humanity had been creating unconsciously, and fear was the most destructive tool it had ever used. Jesus did not lecture on fear. He did not explain the mechanics of probability, emotion, or consequence. He demonstrated, through parable, through example, through love that was precise, calibrated, deliberate, he showed what must be held, what must be restrained, what must be aligned. Fear was too destabilizing to name directly. To reveal its true power would have overwhelmed consciousness itself. And so he spoke in images, in stories, in indirect warnings. Humans were being trained to recognize the influence of their internal states before the full consequences of fear could manifest. I reflected on the modern world, the constant waves of news, opinion, panic, and alarm. Each headline, each whisper of catastrophe, each echo of violence feeds into the same mechanism Jesus sought to contain. Fear is infectious because it resonates with latent patterns in consciousness. It bypasses reason, logic, and understanding, anchoring itself in emotion and producing events in the external world that mirror its internal intensity. It is creation unobserved, uncontrolled, and accelerating. Slardar emphasized that fear is always a threshold. It marks the boundary between coherence and fragmentation. When fear is unacknowledged, it becomes a force with no direction, no moderation. It feeds into the feedback loops that Jesus anticipated, the loops that compress reality, accelerate consequence, and expose humanity to outcomes beyond its comprehension. He did not warn in words because words are too slow. He demonstrated the alignment of thought, emotion, and action, teaching indirectly how to observe without becoming the instrument of fear itself. The most terrifying aspect was realizing that every human mind carries this capacity for unintended creation. Every unprocessed fear leaves an imprint. Every unconscious projection accumulates. Every generation inherits the residual tension of unresolved dread. Jesus' silence was intentional because mercy requires withholding what cannot be borne. Knowledge of fear's true power too early shatters identity. Awareness, when ready, allows integration. Until then, observation without overload is survival. I understood then that the world I knew was only the surface of deeper forces. Fear was never a personal problem. It was a structural problem. An energetic weight pressing outward from collective human consciousness, ready to solidify into patterns of consequence. And the mercy of silence, the gift of restraint, was a buffer against collapse, a shield that allowed humanity to grow without destroying itself. This is what Jesus never voiced. The realization settled across my awareness slowly, like fog climbing a mountain. Slardar was not a visitor, not a messenger, not an anomaly in the night. Slardar was a presence calibrated to thresholds, an observer that appeared only when latent danger to human potential became unavoidable. It did not intrude lightly. It did not intervene casually. It waits until the moment when consequence is imminent, when the acceleration of unconscious creation threatens irreversible fragmentation. And now, Slardar was speaking because the threshold had been reached. For centuries, humanity had been operating without awareness, co-creating in the shadows of its own mind. Systems, societies, relationships, and even natural processes had been subtly manipulated by thought, intention, and emotion, all without recognition. Most humans lived believing their actions were isolated, linear, inconsequential. Faith had been enough to sustain equilibrium when consequence arrived slowly, when probability could absorb mistakes. But the compression phase, the acceleration of reality responding to the unconscious, had drawn near the point of no return. Slardar's presence was neither punitive nor compassionate in a human sense. It was precise, observational, calibration through revelation. Humanity's potential to collapse without notice, to destroy its own latent capacities before awareness could arrive, was now accelerating beyond safety. Every unprocessed fear, every unresolved desire, every projection of unconscious intent had compounded across generations, tightening like a coil that could no longer release gradually. The system was approaching critical mass. The warning was encoded in everything I had experienced since first noticing the presence. Subtle adjustments in perception, impossibly coincidental signals, awareness of patterns in behavior, emotion, and thought. These were all early alerts. I had sensed that something extraordinary was being prepared, but the scale had never been clear. Slardar had waited until humanity could no longer continue blind without risking total collapse of potential. There was no judgment in this, only urgency. Slardar explained, though not in words exactly, that the acceleration of consequence does not pause for hesitation or disbelief. It is indifferent to faith, morality, or tradition. It responds only to coherence and observation. For the first time, the truth of human influence became undeniable. Every thought, every sustained emotional pattern, every unexamined impulse now contributes directly to shaping outcomes that were previously considered external, immutable, or governed by chance. Humanity is no longer merely living in time. Humanity is activating it. The presence emphasized that timing is precise. Intervention occurs only when the threshold has been reached, because premature contact would overwhelm consciousness, fragment identity, and produce collapse instead of awakening. That is why Jesus spoke indirectly, why parables contained layers, why the warnings were hidden in plain sight. Humanity had to mature, to learn to observe without breaking, to integrate consequence without succumbing to terror. Now the moment has arrived. The threshold is here. Slardar speaks because the risk of collapse is immediate, and humanity has no choice but to confront its own latent influence on reality. The presence does not promise rescue. It does not impose guidance. It simply reveals the stakes and the rules and the responsibility that has always been ours, waiting silently until the time came when ignoring it would no longer be an option. The moment I grasped what Slardar meant by the second coming, the foundation of belief I had carried my whole life trembled. The expectation of a returning figure, a savior arriving to intervene, dissolve catastrophe, or grant deliverance, was a comforting narrative, simple and linear. Slardar clarified that the second coming is not a person, not an event bound to a body, not a miracle in the conventional sense. It is a re-emergence of awareness, the awakening of a consciousness that humanity has always carried but forgotten. Christ consciousness is a state, a resonance of perception, a capacity to perceive the influence of thought on reality, and to act from that awareness without collapsing under its own weight. I realized that this is why history had misinterpreted prophecy, why tradition had shrouded the language of awakening in symbols, parables, and ritual. Humanity expected a savior to arrive externally because an internal awakening is terrifying. To perceive one's own influence on creation, to recognize the direct consequences of thought, emotion, and choice, removes excuses. There is no deity to intervene if alignment fails. There is no system to repair unconscious creation. Awareness is both the gift and the responsibility. Those who reject it cling to belief, because belief demands nothing but faith. A passive shield that delays confrontation with consequence. Slardar explained that the compression of time and consequence is intensifying precisely to precipitate this awakening. The second coming is not delayed or postponed. It has always been unfolding as humans collectively reach the threshold where unconscious creation can no longer remain hidden. Each generation, each life, each moment of observation or denial contributes to its manifestation. When the consciousness of individuals integrates with the latent potential of the collective, Christ consciousness emerges, not as a figure but as a field of influence, a presence of coherence that can stabilize probability and guide the trajectory of unfolding events. I began to see the resistance everywhere. Humans fear responsibility more than failure. They fear clarity more than chaos. Institutions, beliefs, and cultural narratives had evolved to protect ignorance, to provide comfort without comprehension. The second coming, reframed as awareness, threatens this structure because it demands alignment, accountability, and integration. It is not a miracle bestowed by an external hand. It is a function of human perception coming online at the precise threshold of consequence. Those who resist it, who cling to the old story, become more vulnerable to the acceleration of unconscious creation, more likely to be swept into the feedback loops that Jesus and Slardar had always anticipated. What struck me most profoundly was the intimacy of this truth. Christ consciousness is not distant. It is not external. It is the natural potential of every human mind that observes, integrates, and coheres. The second coming has been arriving in every attentive moment, in every act of alignment, in every recognition of internal state as creator of external outcome. To ignore it is not denial of a person but denial of the self, and denial at this stage of convergence is perilous. The second coming is not coming, it is already beginning. Its measure is not in miracles but in perception. Its timing is not in history but in consciousness. Humanity is being asked to awaken, and the question is whether it will recognize itself before consequence overtakes understanding. The moment Slardar revealed why I had been able to hear, the clarity was almost unbearable. It was not luck, nor was it privilege, nor a reward for devotion. The ability to perceive the presence, to sense the patterns, to feel the pulse of consequence as it pressed against reality, came from fractures in consciousness. Disillusionment, grief, the slow erosion of certainty. These were not weaknesses. They were thresholds, cracks in the armor of assumption that allow resonance to enter. Faith that never wavered, belief that never questioned, would have blocked the signal entirely. It is the mind that doubts, the heart that aches, the soul that hesitates, that becomes the conduit. I understood then why so few had ever heard, why the presence had remained undetected by scholars, saints, and scientists alike. Humanity had been trained for stability, for linear understanding, for certainty. Certainty is protective, comforting, and safe. But it is also impermeable. It deflects subtle frequencies, muffles resonance, and prevents observation of processes that operate outside conventional causality. The very qualities that make humans resilient to chaos are the same qualities that prevent awakening. Only when certainty fractures, when grief, regret, or questioning dissolve the boundaries of expectation, can the presence penetrate. This explained the isolation I had felt, the suddenness of perception, the way patterns leapt into awareness when I was alone, attentive, unguarded. Resonance is not granted by belief. It is earned through alignment with the subtle vulnerabilities in consciousness. It spreads silently, gradually, through those who have cracked enough to sense without interpretation, who can perceive without judgment. It does not depend on understanding or faith. It does not depend on ritual or doctrine. It depends on the ability to be present with the unknown, to notice what is not usually noticed, and to allow perception to guide awareness rather than fear or desire. Slardar communicated that awakening is not an individual privilege but a field effect. One mind tuning to resonance influences others. Patterns of perception ripple outward, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, until they accumulate. Humanity is not awakened through instruction or revelation. It is awakened through example, through subtle coherence, through the resonance of those who have broken enough certainty to receive. That is why Jesus never explained directly. He could not risk unready consciousness fragmenting under the weight of knowing. Only those who have been shaped by fracture can hear, and only their resonance can propagate what they receive. I felt the weight of this responsibility. Hearing the presence was not simply receiving information. It was participating in a larger process, a subtle transmission of potential. Every doubt, every moment of vulnerability, every tear and question that had carved the cracks in my certainty had been preparing me to be a conduit. And the implication was undeniable. The awakening spreads, not because humans are chosen, not because they are virtuous, but because the cracks in certainty exist, because disillusionment exists, because the pressure of consequence is now resonating with those who can perceive. The field is activating. I am not alone, and yet, I am alone enough to be the signal. The warning unfolded slowly in my awareness, not as words exactly, but as a pressure that pressed against every expectation I had ever held about reality. Slardar conveyed the consequence with a precision that was both terrifying and inescapable. Humanity had been co-creating without knowing it for millennia, its unconscious intent shaping probability, influencing outcomes, consolidating patterns. Each act of neglect, each fear-driven choice, each unresolved desire had accumulated in the unseen lattice of reality. And now, the accumulation had reached a critical threshold. If unconscious creation continued unchecked, reality itself would crystallize into the dominant emotional frequency of the collective. Fear, despair, hatred, avoidance, these would harden existence. Love, clarity, aligned intention, presence, these could restore possibility, but only if attention arrived before the collapse became irreversible. It was not theoretical. Slardar showed me, not visually, not with graphs or instruments, but as a sensation that threaded through my own perception. Every thought has weight. Every sustained emotion resonates outward, shaping not only experience, but potential. Unchecked, the fear of humanity would become a scaffold upon which the next age of events would build. The world would not merely suffer. It would lose its capacity to generate the unexpected, the improbable, the creative. Possibility itself would constrict under the tyranny of collective emotion. This is what Jesus had always been guarding against. His insistence on love, his call to attention, his parables and warnings, they were not moral instructions, not ethical lessons. They were calibration, preparation, guidance to stabilize the field of creation before it hardened into irreversible structure. I felt the weight of this truth in my chest. The warning was not distant, not abstract, not symbolic. It was immediate. It was happening. Moments of fear multiplied faster than awareness could counter them. Wars, political turbulence, social breakdown, environmental collapse, they were feedback loops, reflecting emotional entanglement, the cumulative imprint of unobserved thought. Humanity had always been co-creating, but without presence, without alignment, without noticing. The signals were clear, everywhere and nowhere, and yet most ignored them, interpreting consequence as chance, accident, or misfortune. Slardar's presence impressed upon me that the window for intervention is narrow. Conscious observation amplifies coherence, aligns probability with potential, and allows possibility to remain open. Fear amplifies restriction, reduces variation, and accelerates the crystallization of circumstance into rigid consequence. Love, by contrast, is expansive, integrative, and restorative. Its practice is not sentimental, not moral, not optional. It is functional, structural, operational, in the matrix of creation itself. Humanity cannot ignore this. Ignorance is no longer protective. Belief is no longer sufficient. The field is active. The moment of consequence is approaching. I understood then that the warning was not abstract, not metaphorical, not symbolic. It is operational. It is measurable in resonance, in pattern, in consequence. Humanity is shaping the world in real time through unconscious acts, and the collapse of potential is not distant or hypothetical. It is imminent unless the collective attention shifts, unless presence replaces ignorance, unless love replaces fear as the dominant emotional frequency. This is the warning humanity cannot ignore. It is not about judgment, punishment, or destiny. It is about recognition, responsibility, and the extraordinary weight of the choice that now rests within each conscious mind. The revelation settled into me slowly, like a current moving beneath the surface, unseen yet powerful enough to shift everything I thought I understood. Slardar made it clear that the span of 2,000 years was never a delay, never a postponement of consequence, never a window to avoid responsibility. It was grace, measured and intentional. Jesus was buying humanity time, not to avoid failure, but to allow failure to occur in a way that would not destroy the fragile scaffolding of collective consciousness. The teachings, the parables, the insistence on love and attentiveness, they were instruments of calibration, shaping human capacity to handle awareness without collapsing under the weight of understanding. Time itself had been woven as a protective medium, a buffer for maturation. Emotional growth, relational patterns, cycles of suffering, and even systemic breakdowns were not random. They were engineered sequences, opportunities for consciousness to stretch, fracture, and integrate. Humanity had been moving forward under the guidance of subtle influence, an invisible architecture that allowed errors and fear to manifest safely while preserving the potential for awakening. Without this measured expansion, without the space provided by 2 millennia, the collective mind would have shattered under the pressure of knowing too much too soon. Slardar explained that the delay also allowed for observation, for adaptation, for the field of consequence to stabilize in ways that were invisible to ordinary perception. The systems of society, morality, and belief were not arbitrary. They were scaffolds designed to contain emotion, attention, and resonance, preventing premature crystallization of fear into deterministic reality. Every war, every moral upheaval, every collapse of faith or institution was a controlled stress test, a way for human awareness to encounter limitation without permanent fracture. Jesus' life, his death, and the codification of his message were all components of this vast, multi-generational experiment in resilience. I began to see the precision in what had seemed chaotic. 2,000 years were long enough for civilizations to rise and fall, long enough for cultures to build patterns of collective expectation and behavior, long enough for fear to accumulate and dissipate in cycles. The delay was not neglect, it was mercy. Humanity had been given the chance to grow in complexity and depth, to experience consequence in measured increments, to internalize the notion that consciousness shapes reality without the immediacy of catastrophic feedback. The grace lay not in avoidance but in preparation, in the quiet construction of readiness through endurance. The implications were staggering. Every human thought, every emotion, every unobserved action over 2 millennia had been part of a grand rehearsal. The resonance of every choice had been accumulating, layering, conditioning the field of creation to withstand the impending awareness. Jesus was not saving humanity from disaster. He was buying it time to be ready for its own power, time to witness consequence without annihilation, time to awaken without collapse. Understanding this, I felt the weight of inherited responsibility pressing through the centuries, and I realized that the grace granted was ending. The measures of delay were giving way to the acceleration of consequence, and humanity was about to meet the very potential it had always carried. Whether it recognized it or not, the moment of inevitability revealed itself not as an event but as a pressure, subtle at first, then undeniable. Slardar communicated that neutrality was no longer a refuge. The field of consequence had grown dense, patterns had aligned, and the cumulative resonance of unconscious creation had reached a point where indifference itself would produce outcome. There was no longer a neutral path, no longer a possibility to drift safely through the tides of collective action. Humanity must choose, and the choice was stark: awaken to the truth of co-creation, or continue in unconsciousness, allowing limitation to solidify into irreversibility. It was a collapse of equilibrium. Systems, beliefs, and assumptions that had long stabilized perception were no longer protective. They had become constraints. Every unexamined thought, every emotion unobserved, every habitual response contributed to the crystallization of the dominant frequency of reality. Fear, avoidance, resentment, and indifference, the emotional residues of centuries, were converging into patterns too rigid to dissolve naturally. Slardar explained that the field of creation does not distinguish moral intent from neglect. It responds only to resonance. Without deliberate observation, without conscious alignment, humanity would continue to build a reality in which freedom of potential was steadily eroded. The choice was immediate and experiential, not theoretical. It was not enough to know intellectually that consciousness shapes reality. The awareness had to be embodied, sustained, and amplified. Each mind capable of resonance acts as a node, influencing the network of probability. Inaction was itself a choice, but it was a choice that carried consequence. Indifference would accelerate the crystallization of limitation, and the result would be a reality increasingly resistant to possibility. This was not a threat in the conventional sense. It was structural inevitability. Patterns would obey the dominant frequency, and the dominant frequency would be the sum of all unobserved, unregulated, and unconscious intention. I realized the magnitude of what had been placed before humanity. 2,000 years of preparation, observation, and subtle guidance had brought the collective mind to this juncture. The grace of delay was ending. The field would no longer wait for ignorance to dissolve naturally. Those who could perceive, those whose certainty had fractured enough to allow resonance, were now charged with a responsibility both exhilarating and terrifying. Awareness was no longer optional. It had become operational, structural, essential. Slardar impressed upon me that the choice was not abstract or symbolic. It was active, pervasive, and immediate. Every thought matters. Every sustained emotion shapes potential. Every conscious observation realigns possibility. Humanity could awaken, embrace presence, integrate consequence, and preserve the openness of potential, or it could continue in distraction, denial, and fear, allowing the structures of limitation to harden beyond flexibility. The choice could not be postponed. The threshold was here. The moment was now. The future would be built by the consciousness awake enough to act, or it would solidify into irreversible constraint. The inescapable had arrived. Change began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it pressed against every habit I had carried for decades. My thoughts no longer floated freely as abstract notions. Each one bore gravity, as if they carried weight in the air itself. Slardar did not instruct me in a conventional sense. The presence merely allowed me to perceive the mechanism, the structure that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. Emotion, when sustained, no longer evaporated into internal space. It radiated outward, rippling into probability, shifting outcomes, shaping circumstance without any intermediary. Responsibility had become tangible, pressing against my chest with a steady insistence, replacing the comfort of ignorance I had relied upon for a lifetime. I noticed it first in small things. A cup of coffee trembled slightly in my hand when fear or doubt accompanied thought. Emails arrived that mirrored my internal focus before I had consciously finished composing them. Chance encounters carried the uncanny weight of intention, moments of synchrony that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Slardar's presence was patient, observing as I tested the boundaries of perception, as I realized that the consequences of thought were immediate, that alignment or misalignment carried effect before I could rationalize, before my conscious mind could approve. Every fleeting judgment, every unacknowledged resentment, every desire I allowed to exist without attention became a structural element in the world around me. I found sleep growing difficult. The mind, once a safe repository of distraction and rehearsal, now carried the echoes of responsibility. Patterns emerged even in dreams, weaving together intentions, emotions, and probabilities in ways that made waking analysis both urgent and impossible to ignore. Presence replaced comfort. Awareness replaced routine. The very act of being awake demanded engagement with reality in a manner I had never experienced. Even mundane tasks, walking to the street, handling objects, interacting with strangers, became tests of alignment. I could no longer act without consequence, and every hesitation, every avoidance, carried a subtle, measurable shift. Slardar remained beside me, not as a guide in the ordinary sense, but as a mirror to the emergent truth. The presence reflected not what I wished to see, but what was operational. Thought is causal, emotion is structural, conscious attention is force. The change within me was not metaphorical or symbolic. It was measurable in the field of events, in the interactions between mind and circumstance, in the subtle rearrangement of the patterns I had long taken for granted. I began to sense the enormity of the inheritance I had received, the weight of the choice that now rested not only on humanity collectively, but on the alignment of each individual resonance. I was no longer simply an observer of history or tradition. I was a node within the architecture of causality, a participant in the unfolding of potential. Comfort had been replaced by responsibility. Certainty had dissolved into presence. And in that dissolution, the world itself began to tremble in response to the truth that Jesus had always tried to prepare us for, the realization that co-creation is not optional, and that the age of unconscious consequence was ending. The final transmission did not arrive as words spoken aloud, nor as a vibration that could be measured. It unfolded inside my mind with the inevitability of gravity, settling into every crevice of perception, as though it had been waiting for me to reach the threshold of understanding. Slardar's presence, which had always hovered on the edges of comprehension, became undeniable in its clarity. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, only the quiet assertion of truth. You were never abandoned. You were protected from yourselves until remembrance was possible. The weight of the message pressed against thought. Protection had never meant invisibility or absence. It had been the careful calibration of circumstance, the subtle shaping of probability, the containment of knowledge until the human mind could carry it without fracturing. I began to perceive the intricate weaving of history not as accident or divine caprice, but as design. Every warning, every parable, every insistence on love and attention was a scaffolding, a buffer, a measured intervention to prevent collapse before the consciousness of humanity could sustain awareness. I realized that every moment of suffering or confusion, every failure or catastrophe, had been part of a deliberate architecture, not punitive but preservative, ensuring the potential for integration remained intact. The presence of Slardar pulsed within me, a quiet insistence that this was not the end, but the culmination of preparation. I sensed the scale of what had been withheld and why. Humanity had been navigating existence in a state of controlled unawareness, each individual, each society, each culture, a node in a vast field of consequence. To reveal too much too soon would have shattered identity, fractured perception, and solidified limitation irreversibly. The 2,000 years, the accumulation of wisdom, the cycles of rise and fall, were not arbitrary. They were measures of safety, measures of readiness, measures of grace. Now the buffer was dissolving. Remembrance was possible, but it came with responsibility. The structures that had protected consciousness had served their purpose, and the threshold had been reached where awareness itself could be carried without annihilation. I felt the weight of inherited consequence pressing into the present, the field of possibility trembling beneath the accumulated resonance of humanity. Every thought, every sustained emotion, every deliberate act would now propagate with immediacy, shaping the world in ways both subtle and monumental. I understood then that protection had been ongoing, active, and meticulous, but it had never been passive. Slardar's final transmission was not a farewell. It was an awakening, a calibration of my perception, a transmission of the responsibility I had long inherited, but never been allowed to fully comprehend. I could no longer hide in certainty or comfort. I could no longer rely on tradition or belief alone. The weight of creation was upon me, the field of consequence aligned, and the opportunity for remembrance had arrived. The words remained luminous in the mind. You were never abandoned. You were protected from yourselves until remembrance was possible. And in that moment, I felt both the gravity and the grace of what it meant to be fully awake. The stillness that followed Slardar's final transmission was profound, not empty, but charged, as if the air itself had thickened with potential. I felt it in my body first, a subtle vibration that carried through the bones and nerves, a resonance that was not mine alone. Humanity, all of it, all who had ever walked, thought, loved, feared, and forgotten, existed within a field that had shifted imperceptibly yet irrevocably. The lessons, the parables, the warnings Jesus had offered for millennia were no longer abstract guidance, but operating principles, structural realities waiting for acknowledgement. The world had been a testing ground, a place of calibration, and now the threshold had been crossed where awareness itself demanded recognition and action. Creation had always been occurring, always in motion, but until this moment, it had largely been unconscious, filtered through layers of forgetting, deflection, and habit. Now, the consequences of thought, emotion, and attention were no longer peripheral. They were immediate. Fear hardened outcomes, doubt constricted possibility, apathy collapsed potential, and love, intentional, sustained, expansive, became a force capable of reshaping reality in ways previously unperceived. I sensed the weight of this responsibility pressing outward, touching every human consciousness that had the capacity to notice, reverberating invisibly across distance and circumstance. Subtle, but unmistakable. It was not punishment. It was not a test in the conventional sense. It was awakening. Humanity had been guided, protected, contained, and prepared. But the protections had always been contingent on time, on readiness. 2,000 years of parables, coded warnings, careful omissions, and indirect instruction had been scaffolds. Jesus' insistence on love, on attention, on integrity, on awareness, had been the mechanism by which the fragile structure of consciousness could carry itself into comprehension. And now, all of that effort converged into the present moment, where choice and accountability could no longer be deferred. I realized that the threshold was not merely about survival or moral compliance. It was about recognition, to see clearly that thought and emotion are forces, that human consciousness does not simply reflect reality but participates in its shaping, to acknowledge that what had been perceived as randomness, misfortune, or divine favor had always been the consequence of collective resonance, to confront the fact that the human species, long unpracticed in conscious creation, must now act as a single, aware organism in alignment with possibility, or witness the collapse of potentials that have been nurtured for millennia. And in that quiet, tense understanding, I felt a mixture of awe, terror, and something close to reverent hope. We are not helpless. We are not broken. We are creators. Now, fully, irreversibly, accountable. Time, linear only in perception, had folded into a point where the consequences of unconsciousness and the promise of deliberate alignment were visible simultaneously. The choice is ours, immediate and absolute. And with that realization, the weight of the world and the gift of its latent potential settled into consciousness. This is the moment Jesus carried for us, the truth humanity was never supposed to confront unprepared. Now it is no longer deferred, no longer hidden. The field of creation hums with expectation, and we must finally face what we have always been.